Senator Hawley knows very clearly that the First Amendment does not apply. He knows the law, he knows this doctrine, and he's telling constituents and using media to suggest otherwise.
People are trying to silence each other. People aren't listening to each other.
At the end of the day, free speech is about us and who we are. It's a garbage in, garbage out problem. I mean, we can talk about lots of people and actors we want to blame. Social media, private companies, government. But at the end of the day, we're forming the people we are, and that's a problem.
The law has a role to play in solving these problems, and so too do the ways that tech companies design their systems. And if they're not going to design them in a socially productive way, particularly the big ones, in a way that is prompted by the market, then I think there is a very strong case for regulation. And I think that would be a place where I do agree with Senator Hawley.
I'm Sarah Fenske. This is St. Louis on the Air. Perhaps you've heard that earlier this month, Senator Josh Hawley lost his book deal. He's certainly been talking about it a lot. Our junior senator in Missouri sought to stop Pennsylvania's electoral votes from being counted. Those actions are now linked to a riot at the Capitol that left several people dead. Simon & Schuster wanted nothing to do with Hawley's book after that. Now, Hawley called the canceled deal, quote, a direct assault on the First Amendment. But was it really? What does the First Amendment say or not say about some of the things that stand in the way of us freely sharing our views in the year 2021? And is this 230-year-old text sufficient for the free speech issues that we face today? Well, joining us to talk about that today are two law professors at Washington University. Neil Richards is the Koch Distinguished Professor in Law at WashU. He's also director of the Cordell Institute for Policy in Medicine and Law. Neil, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined today by John Anazu. He's the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University. John, welcome.
Thanks, Sarah. Great to be here, and great to be here with Neil.
So, Neil, I want to start with you. Josh Hawley, he's a Yale Law School graduate. Does he have a First Amendment right to see this book get published?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's a tremendous degree of irony in Senator Hawley complaining about cancel culture. On the one hand, conservatives usually like market ordering, and so if a business decides to go one way or the other, for him to claim a constitutional violation, I think, is a little bit rich. There's another irony as well, which is that Senator Hawley, who complains about being canceled, but he seems to be everywhere all at once. For somebody who is allegedly canceled, there's an awful lot of Senator Hawley everywhere across media. And of course, he was able to get a different book deal with a different publisher, and I believe will be distributed internationally by Simon & Schuster. But I think more generally, I think there are tremendously important issues of free speech here about who gets to say what, when can the government or other people stop them from talking, and what is the right balance between expression and stability?
Mm-hmm. I think those are some great questions. And John, I'm curious if you see any concerns with Simon & Schuster pulling the plug on this book.
You know, normatively, I think there are some concerns, and I agree with Neil about the values question, but I think it's a little more insidious than this. I think Senator Hawley knows very clearly that the First Amendment does not apply. He knows the law, he knows this doctrine, and he's telling constituents and using media to suggest otherwise. So I think there's a bit of a deliberate obfuscation here by Senator Hawley. That said, there are really important questions that I'm sure we'll be talking about in terms of who gets to control speech and what the consequences are.
Mm-hmm. This question of who gets to control speech, I was thinking about this a lot in the final days of Donald Trump's presidency when Twitter kicked him off its platform. They basically said the president doesn't have the right to tweet. Some of these issues we're talking about, Neil, do any of them apply here? Does he have a First Amendment right to be on Twitter?
So I think the answer to that is no. But before we get any further, I think it's important, and I hope John will agree with this, it's important to draw a distinction here between the First Amendment, which is a provision in the Constitution that regulates the government's ability to restrict expression, and freedom of speech, which is a fundamental right of all of us to express ourselves, and that the First Amendment tries to protect against the government. But there are tremendous issues with, if we care about our free speech culture, if we care about practical ability to engage in freedom of speech, then I think we need to think much more broadly than the relatively narrow strictures of the First Amendment. But as a First Amendment matter, no, he doesn't.
So what about as a free speech matter? John, do you see potential concerns here with Twitter deciding, hey, this voice doesn't belong on our platform?
Sure. I mean, as a matter of norms, it's incredibly important. And just to give you an example of how complicated it is, though, the UN Declaration of Human Rights talks about speech and expression and opinions without interference. And so when we think about what does it mean to have speech without interference, it's impossible. There's interference from government, there's interference from the private sector, there's interference from our fellow citizens. And so as we navigate free speech norms, I think we have to start with the reality of interference and then ask about how we mitigate it and how we honor each other's speech as best as possible.
Neil, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think we're doing a good job right now of creating a place where speech can be free, where people can speak to to the issues that are important to them?
That's a great question. I would say no. I think there's a tremendous irony that in the United States right now, the First Amendment has probably never been stronger. There have probably never been so few government restrictions on expression on any society at any point in human history. But at the same time, the United States is experiencing an undeniable free speech crisis. People are trying to silence each other. People aren't listening to each other. At many times, it seems that different members of our society are living in parallel and almost untouching realities. And I think that's, if we're interested in building a cohesive democratic society that produces good governing decisions more often than not, when it comes to the free speech side of things, I think we're in a very bad place.
John, would you share that concern that we're in a very bad place right now?
I do, and really it's because at the end of the day, free speech is about us and who we are. It's a garbage in, garbage out problem. And so when we look at, we can talk about lots of people and actors we want to blame, social media, private companies, government, but at the end of the day, all of these actors are responding to what we do, and they're complicating it with algorithms and other motives, but at the end of the day, we're forming the people we are, and that's a problem.
Well, if you're listening to this conversation, we imagine you may well have some thoughts on these issues of free speech. Let's start with a simple question for those of you out there listening. Do you think Twitter was right to ban Donald Trump? And if you think it was right, do you fear who they could decide to ban next? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us a tweet at STL on air or email us at talk@stlpublicradio.org. Neil, I see what you mean about how our humanity really is at the source of this problem. But so much of what gives me pause these days has to do with big tech's control over what gets heard and who's deciding what gets heard and which voices come to the fore. I will admit I was a bit relieved after Donald Trump was off Twitter. It seemed to be a more pleasant experience on there with him gone. But I'm vaguely terrified about the idea that Twitter could decide that somebody who is in the opposition to the government, that those voices might be too toxic to allow. Are there concerns about Twitter's power over our politics?
Absolutely. Or even if Twitter were decided to marginalize or censor someone who was critical of Twitter, or someone who was a groundswell of support for the regulation of big tech in the public interest. And I think it's really important, Sarah, as you do, to separate the question of was Twitter right to ban Trump, and does big tech have too much power over the expressive culture of our society? Personally, I think the answer to both questions is yes, which is why this is such a particularly thorny problem.
Neil, I'm curious what you think. Is the answer to both of those questions yes, from your point of view?
So John here. I think the challenge is that when it comes to both free speech law and free speech norms, harm is subjective. So whether you experience harm from someone's speech or whether I experience harm, I could say the same word to 10 people and they could experience it differently. So then it becomes a subjective judgment over who is harmed by speech. And whether you ask the government to do that or whether you ask Twitter to do that, some subjective group of human actors is deciding what counts as harm, deciding what the boundaries are, and that's an incredibly complicated decision. And so whether it's under the law or whether it's under the norms of a private company, I just agree with Neil that we've got a lot of potential opportunity for abuse, especially when it's done secretly or privately without consideration of the reasons.
I want to go to the phone lines. We have a number of callers who are interested in joining us. Let's just take a few here. Kim is calling from St. Louis. Kim, what's your take on this issue?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I don't usually agree with, banning speech, but in terms of Trump off of Twitter, I think that it was appropriate because the fate of the republic was at stake. If you think analytically about what Hitler did before he took over that government, it was textbook for what he was doing. I mean, having people attack the government, if you just go back and look at it historically, and I fear that because instead of the Jews, maybe it would be people of color, which is myself, who would be the target of such a horrible type of government.
Kim, thank you for sharing that perspective. And I certainly think that seems to be a popular perspective in America right now. I think overall this ban has played pretty well for Twitter. John, do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And, I'm actually kind of deeply conflicted over what I think about it because like you, I was kind of glad not to have to see the tweets anymore. I guess one concern I have, though, is the timing of it, and it's linked to imminent danger and whether that was there. I mean, because in some ways it's not like he hadn't been doing that for quite some time, and so in terms of the justification for the urgency and imminence of it at that moment, I don't know. I mean, I think it raises some really complicated questions, but you're right that it seems to be playing fairly well right now.
And Neil, it feels like, one of the things we keep hearing about is this word incitement, which maybe we didn't hear about prior to a couple years ago. But this now seems to be tangled up in our free speech debate. What are the roots of that being an exception to free speech?
So actually, the incitement doctrine under the First Amendment is where we get our modern First Amendment from. I think a lot of people, certainly before I started studying these questions, I was in this group, a lot of people just assume that Americans have always enjoyed broad free speech protections. But actually, there was all sorts of censorship from the founding through the 19th century. It's only after World War I where we actually get the growth of a speech protective First Amendment in the incitement cases, in cases originally involving anarchists and immigrants and communists who were criticizing the U.S. war effort. And it's actually really only until after World War II that those protections get built into law, and only until the 1960s in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, where the Supreme Court coalesced on the doctrine and ruled that you are generally able to talk politics and say wacky things, and to encourage law reform and to criticize the government. But when you cross three lines, the government is able to regulate. And this is the famous Brandenburg test. You have to first intentionally incite, imminent lawless action. First intentionally incite, second, lawless action that is imminent, and third, that is likely. And as John said, Trump probably did that. John didn't say this. I don't want to put words in your mouth, John. Trump probably incited imminent lawless action on a week before Inauguration Day, but he probably isn't inciting imminent lawless action now. His free speech crimes extend to misinformation, to attacking individuals. They extend even before this Twitter ban to threats against other countries. I remember there was a spat he got into with the North Korean dictator over the use of nuclear weapons. But incitement is those three things: intentional incitement of lawful action, two, that is imminent, and 3 that is likely.
It seems like maybe it was imminent at a point when people hadn't cut off his megaphone. Then it happened. They cut off his megaphone after the fact. John, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I might see this a little differently than Neil. The imminent standard is very hard to meet, and rightly so. And so it's not even clear to me that in the moments before, the days before January 6th, that Trump would have been guilty of imminent incitement to lawbreaking. And the reason that we have such a high standard here is we don't want, in other contexts, for example, civil rights protesters to be on the hook for imminent incitement to something that ends up being law-breaking or trespassing or something like that in a protest or violence. And there's good reason that we don't want certain leaders from those movements to be on the hook. And so it's not at all clear to me that really anybody would be legally culpable for incitement around the Capitol in terms of the public actors. But the closest, I think, is Rudy Giuliani, who right before talks about trial by combat. But even I'm not even sure that would count legally. There's certainly incitement among some of the actual actors who are storming the Capitol, and rightly so.
We do need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. We're talking today about the First Amendment and about free speech. Big issues here. Our guests are 2 Washington University law professors. The first is Neil Richards. He's the Koch Distinguished Professor in Law at Washington University and director of the Cordell Institute for Policy in Medicine and Law. We're also joined by John Anazu. He's the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University. And we're going to go back to the phone lines. We have a whole bunch of people wanting to join this conversation. And Michael is calling from South St. Louis County. Hey, Michael, you are on St. Louis on the Air.
Hello. Nice to talk to you. I wanted to say that I think that sometimes social media is seen as something separate from any other kind of media. In other words, they should be treated in a lot of ways the way any publication would be. I sent a letter to the editor, for example, and it didn't get published. So in that sense, I could say, well, I was censored, or I was canceled. But they've always curated letters to the editor, whereas I could have posted it on Facebook and, maybe 5 people would have read it, but it would have been published. So I really think that in that sense, the Facebook, Twitter, and other social media should start considering themselves to be the same as any other media organization.
Michael, thank you for that. That's an interesting perspective here. And to my distinguished guests, I think that wades right into the question of, can they do the kind of moderation that they would need to do effectively? John, do you have any faith in Facebook's ability to be able to decide which comments should stay and which should go?
Well, I have my doubts in the process, but also just in the platform. And so, one of the challenges is that unlike print media or unlike some of our prior technology, the replies don't work the same. So, when misinformation goes viral, it's not like the correction follows it, like you would see in the paper of years ago. So that's a real challenge. And then another challenge is the news. When we think about online and communication, it's really all of us who are now participants in that in a way that we weren't with television and print media. So that actually complicates it quite a bit in terms of the attempt to regulate information, truth, and those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and I can say as a former newspaper editor, part of my job was trying to decide which comments had to stay and which had to go. That was incredibly difficult, even as someone who's been trained in journalism. I could easily pick what letter to the editor should run, but which comment is too toxic to stay? They were all toxic. But let's go back to the phone lines. Andrew is calling from St. Louis. Andrew, hi, you're on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, it's been a long time. Those of us that remember Alex Jones, that I learned about 10 years ago.
InfoWars.
InfoWars. And then, 8chan and 4chan and all these websites. And over the last couple of years, especially in this past year, I've been waiting, like, why is Donald Trump still allowed to tweet when you've had other people deplatformed specifically because they're spreading lies and conspiracy theories? And when finally he came off, I was like, it's a lot of talk today, but I'm like, we've seen this before, and we got to equate him to somebody like Alex Jones, and that's why he's gone, just like Alex Jones.
Andrew, thank you for that perspective. Neil, I'm curious your thoughts on this idea of spreading disinformation being enough to get somebody's opinion silenced.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, so my other field, in addition to free speech, is privacy law. So I've been living with big tech companies for as an academic for about 20 years now. I think when we think about Twitter and we ask, why didn't Twitter do more? Twitter is, in some respects, Donald Trump saved Twitter. We say Twitter more times in connection with Trump. But we talk about it a lot because of it, and Twitter became the public forum for discussion of policy issues. It drove the news cycle for 4 years. Here's the problem: technology companies, like all companies, are interested in making money, and they design their systems, and they have great ability to control the design of their systems. As engineers, they design their systems with a particular purpose in mind. Facebook and Twitter have designed their systems for what they call engagement, getting you to use their system. Because of the way their advertising model works, that translates directly into revenue. And they've backed into, as they've realized that their design of their systems has an effect on our democratic culture, they've backed into things like free speech, like with Facebook's so-called Supreme Court or Twitter's moderation rules. And I think the real challenge is they've approached these questions as not what must we do, what should we do to make our democracy stronger. They've approached them with what must we do in order to keep making lots of money. And I think until the appropriate incentives are placed upon those companies as companies to design their systems that have a tremendous effect on our politics, our democracy, and the lives of ordinary people, to design those systems in a way that promotes democratic values and an expansive, as John would say, pluralistic view of free speech, then I think we're going to continue to have this problem, and we're going to continue to have the Mark Zuckerbergers of the world spout platitudes about free speech without really understanding it and without really doing anything to solve these serious problems that face our democracy and our culture.
Dave left a really interesting point on our St. Louis on the Air Facebook page, where there's also a debate raging about this very issue even as we speak. Dave says, I think the problem isn't technology, it's monopolies. Break up or nationalize the tech giants, then you don't have to fret about those private companies controlling modern discourse. John, do you think he's possibly onto something here? It's the size of these platforms that make their power so terrifying.
Certainly the power and the monopoly aspect is challenging here, but there's a branding issue that makes it very difficult to think through how you would effectively break up a monopoly. I mean, it just doesn't make a ton of sense to think about alternate platforms that can capture a similar market share. And one reason I think that technology is really the key driver here is because of the kinds of things, the decisions that Neil was talking about, what they've led to in terms of algorithms. These are very sophisticated systems that are intended to beat us. And if we think that we're going to beat them by sheer willpower or the ability not to get sucked into this stuff, we're kidding ourselves. And so in terms of sort of how do we get out of this, I think we need to be thinking of radical steps we can take to detox from our online engagement, because we're not going to beat the algorithms.
So, John, I mean, I like what you're saying, and personally, I probably need that detox. But as you say, these tech giants are so big, and these problems are so big. The idea of it coming back to the individual, it almost lets them off the hook a little bit, no?
Oh, no, for sure. And so I think this has to be a multi-pronged approach. And I think the kinds of arguments that Neil's raising and the critiques he's making are absolutely right. I don't think we have the legal toolkit yet to figure it all out, but we need people looking at this very seriously at different levels of government, respecting both the First Amendment and the public-private distinction, but also recognizing that these are very serious problems for our society and our democracy, and we need to think about legal and regulatory tools that could work effectively. But at the same time, I don't think, you and I can kind of wait around and depend on government to come through for us here.
Mm-hmm. Neil, thoughts on what could be a solution beyond, obviously, that important personal responsibility we have not to keep ourselves in the middle of this madness?
Yeah, I think the monopoly point is a really interesting one, and I would agree with John that you can't really break up Facebook. I mean, you could disaggregate some of Facebook's businesses, right? You could separate Facebook from Instagram. Would be an easy way to deal with some of it, but Facebook is Facebook. As a privacy advocate myself, I have deep problems with many aspects of Facebook's business, but I use it because my cousins in the United Kingdom are on there, and I can see pictures of their children and what they've cooked for dinner, and it's because it's where the people are. Now, that aspect of size, whether it's a natural monopoly, could counsel towards some regulation of Facebook as a utility in the public interest. So I think I guess it wasn't a caller; it was a poster. The poster is right that the size is a tremendous part of this problem, but I think we want to be even more thoughtful about the consequences of that size, and maybe there are ways to take advantage of the size through a more ready pathway to regulation of them, rather than breaking them up if it is in fact a natural monopoly. And that's a question that I think we need to think about as well.
I'm going to go back to the phone lines. Kumar is calling from St. Louis. Kumar, hi, you're on St. Louis on the air.
Yes. I'm glad the Twitter. Can you listen to me?
Kind of. Let's try this. Let's try one more time and see if we can get this to work.
Okay.
Kumar?
Okay.
Unfortunately, I think we're having some technical problems there. I'm sorry, Kumar. I would have loved to hear your thoughts on this. We did hear something interesting on Twitter from Grace. She writes, please differentiate between free speech and freedom from consequences of one's speech. And could you dig deeper into the irony of GOPers wanting a free market unless it affects them? I think this kind of goes back to Josh Hawley. He's been talking about woke mobs. Does he have a point when he talks about the people being afraid of the woke mob? As much as I hate that term, is he maybe getting at something that is happening in American discourse? John Inazu.
Well, he's tapping into an impulse, and he does this very well. He's tapping into an impulse that's felt by a number of people. And I think there is a sense, back to our earlier discussion about can you have speech that's uninhibited and without pressures on it. Everything we say is going to generate pressures back. And in certain contexts, in certain environments, some of that pressure will feel mob-like, and it will stifle speech, and that cuts in all directions. There's no kind of partisan claim to this one, and it depends on the context a lot. So there is a point in which non-governmental actors can effectively squelch speech and discourse, and it happens all the time. It's very difficult to think what to do about it. For the record, I want to agree with Neil that Senator Hawley's speech is not being squelched.
Sure. that guy is everywhere, and that's why I hate even quoting him on this. But Neil, are you concerned that to some extent the almost violent reaction that can greet certain unpopular ideas, it can become a problem or has become a problem in this country?
I do agree with that. I think what is important in a diverse society that is nevertheless interconnected and dependent upon everyone's success and health for our own success and health is that we learn to live with each other. And I think there can and sometimes should be consequences for outrageous expression. But I think, and John has written extensively about this, we need to have an agreement to disagree, that we need to be able to live with each other. And this is a cultural commitment, much more so than it is a technological one or a legal one, though the law and technology will have a role to play in this. We need to be able to live with each other in a way that we can get along with each other. And I think we need to be less eager to take offense and less eager to criticize. But that said, Josh Hawley whipping up his audience by calling his opponents woke leftists is certainly exacerbating the kinds of problems he's complaining about rather than contributing to the common good.
Neil, in our final couple minutes here, I'm curious about your perspective as somebody from the UK. Does anyone do a better job with all of these issues than we've talked about than the US? Could we look to another country as a model?
I think we could look to Canada. I mean, Canadians are famous for being painfully nice to one another, and I think ultimately that's what we need to be able to do. Is we need to be able to realize that we're not always going to agree with the people we live with in society, but if we're going to stay in that society, we need to live with those people in society, and I think we need to be able to give people the benefit of the doubt. We need to be able to realize that even though someone thinks something that we think to be, as Justice Holmes won't put it, an opinion we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, that we have to recognize their common humanity and try to talk to them and try to understand them, even if we're not going to agree, but we learn to live with them. And I think that the law has a role to play in solving these problems, and so too do the ways that tech companies design their systems. And if they're not going to design them in a socially productive way, particularly the big ones, in a way that is prompted by the market, then I think there is a very strong case for regulation. And I think that would be a place where I do agree with Senator Hawley in that considering the role of big tech in our society and their power is something we need to take seriously, but we need to do so without insulting people we disagree with.
Mm-hmm. John and Azu, just in our final minute here, what's the thought you'd want to leave us with today?
Just to underscore something that Neil said, this is ultimately not about a legal or a technical fix. It's a cultural fix that starts with us. And so we need to be thinking, what are the institutions, the practices, and the habits that can get us to figure out more how we can find common ground, even when we don't agree on the common good.
John and Azu, Sally D. Danforth, Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
And Neil Richards, Koch Distinguished Professor in Law at Washington University. Thank you for joining us as well.
Thanks, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.